Great honor to be here with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Todd Erdner, and I previously was known as the guy with 13 kids in the church, but Seth decided that he wanted to share that title with me as well. So now Seth and I are known as the guy with 13 kids. But my older kids grew up in the era of VeggieTales. Right, in the glory days of VeggieTales, kind of my older kids were coming up, and Michelle and I are not big media people, but we did let our kids watch VeggieTales. You know, their motto was Saturday morning fun, Sunday morning values. And if you understand what Saturday morning fun is, you're my age, because it used to be cartoons were only available on Saturday mornings, but we've kind of passed that now. But VeggieTales, and one of my favorite VeggieTales was Madame Blueberry. And Madame Blueberry starts out with Larry the Cucumber, and he comes driving out in his new Sonic action Jeep, and he comes zooming out, and Bob the Tomato says, "Wow, that's really cool. Are you happy now?" He's like, "No, I need the action trailer and the action jet ski." And Bob's like, "Oh, well, if you get that, will you be happy? How much stuff do you need to be happy?" And Larry goes, "I don't know. How much stuff is there?" And it's one of VeggieTales, I think, great truths. And so the Madame Blueberry is that Madame Blueberry lives in a tree house, and she has all this stuff, but she gets a catalog because the Stuff Mart is building a store by her house. And she gets this catalog of all the stuff that the Stuff Mart has, and she looks at her house, and she sees, wow, my couch is kind of dirty and run down, and my dishes are out of style. And all of a sudden, she's unhappy because she doesn't have the stuff that the Stuff Mart has. And so Madame Blueberry then begins her quest of waiting for the Stuff Mart to open, and she goes on this journey to the Stuff Mart. And on her way, she sees a little family having a picnic. And she sees this little girl with basically nothing, but just with a happy, happy heart. And so Madame Blueberry goes and asks her, like, "Why are you so happy? You have nothing." And the little girl says, "A thankful heart is a happy heart." And I think, what a profound truth from a bunch of vegetables. But you know, it's all based on God's truth. Right? A thankful heart is a happy heart. And this idea of coveting, or always wanting more and more of what you probably already have enough of, is something that I've really struggled with in my life, and is something that I want to take a look at this morning. I have so enjoyed what Pastor Brent has done in the Gospel of John. I think he has just done a fantastic job of laying out the Gospel of John, explaining it to us, and making it relevant to us today. And so I wanted to kind of stay away from the Gospel of John and let Pastor Brent just continue doing his thing there. And so we're going to look in Luke today, and we're going to turn to Luke chapter 12 and look at a story that Jesus is going to tell there. And as we do that, since we're switching to a new book, it's always very useful you have to go back a little bit before the passage that we study to understand what the context of the passage was. And so you don't need to follow along here, but I'm just going to read a few of these here. So at the end of Luke chapter 11, Jesus basically goes, "Woe against the Pharisees. Woe to you, Pharisees. Woe to you, Pharisees. Woe to you, Pharisees." Basically, he was calling out all the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And then the Pharisees in 11:45 says, "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us too." Right? So they're getting it. And then he says, "But woe to you, lawyers. Woe to you, scribes." And he goes on. And then at the end, he says, when he left there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to be very hostile and questioned Jesus closely on many subjects, plotting against him to catch him in anything he might say. Okay? So the context here is in Luke. The Pharisees and the scribes and all the religious leaders are furious with Jesus. Okay? And then we turn to chapter 12, verse 1, and it says, "Under these circumstances, so many thousands of the multitude had gathered together that they were stepping on one another." And Jesus begins teaching. Okay, so the context here of Luke chapter 12 that we're going to look at is The Pharisees and the scribes are very angry with him and are actively looking at how can they get Jesus. right? But Jesus is still drawing thousands of people to come hear him teach. And so he starts teaching in Luke chapter 12, and he's basically going to say, don't worry about the things of this world. Don't worry about the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders. And if they drag you into court, don't worry. I will tell you and I will give you what you need to say to them. Okay? And so he's preaching this message, and then we're going to look at the passage. We're going to look at Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. And it says, and someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you? And he said to them, Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. You know, a cynic once said, preaching is talking while another man is sleeping. And every preacher takes great consolation in this passage because Jesus has been preaching to the crowds about, don't worry, God will take care of you and provide for you. And then all of a sudden, some guy works his way up from the back of the crowd and asks a question that has nothing to do what he was talking about. Right? And so when I'm preaching, and I sit in the pews most Sunday, and I know how easy it is to let the worries of the world and the distractions and the things that are going on and like kind of consume my thoughts. And so even Jesus had that challenge of people weren't even sometimes paying attention to what he had to say, but they were so concerned and so wrapped up in their own issues that they were dealing with. And so in this particular case, this man works his way up amongst the thousands of people so that he can get close enough to Jesus and says, Jesus, tell my brother to split the inheritance with me. Okay, now, in Jewish culture, what happens is when the father died, the older son was responsible to divide up the inheritance among the family. Okay, and so we can assume in this situation, this was probably the younger son going up to Jesus and saying, Hey, Jesus, can you get my older brother to divide the inheritance among us? Because the older brother wasn't doing what he should have been doing. And Jesus responds back with saying, with in essence, not even answering his question, right? And the man probably came to Jesus because in the culture, it was an honor-shame culture. So the younger son was coming before the crowd to try to shame his older brother into doing something that he should be doing anyway. And so he comes to Jesus as a religious leader. And you know, we have a parallel today. Sometimes we in the congregation will come to Pastor Brent with an issue or something that we may have with somebody. And Pastor Brent doesn't have any legal authority, doesn't have any power to do anything, but we, as an influential teacher and someone that we respect, we say, hey, maybe Pastor Brent can help us in this situation today. And so that's the same way that this man was. This man was approaching Jesus and saying, hey, Jesus, maybe you can help get this guy to do what is right by appealing to this man's honor that he should do what's right. And Jesus doesn't answer the question. Jesus says back to him, man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you? And it sounds a little bit weird, but think of it like this. Think of it as, who appointed me as the local county judge dealing with these type of affairs? That's really what Jesus is saying, right? Jesus is saying, I'm not the local county judge. My mission here on earth is not to settle your squabble and your squabble and your squabble and your squabble. So Jesus wasn't being rude. He's just saying, I'm not that person. I'm not that county judge. But then Jesus does what Jesus is so good at doing. He doesn't answer the question. He goes right for the heart of the matter. The matter that was not whether the older son was going to divide the inheritance or not. The issue was that man's heart in asking that question. And just as a kind of a temporary reminder here to all of us, sometimes we go to God with our request. and we don't get what we think we should get. And it's not that God didn't hear us. Jesus clearly heard the man and heard the request. But Jesus knew that there was something greater that needed to be dealt with here as opposed to what his request was. And I have an illustration in my own life of when I was at the end of my junior year in college at Vanderbilt. One of the highest offices that a person can hold is honor council president. And I had been part of honor council for 3 years, and I'd become a Christian in college, and I thought, what a great way that I could, as a Christian, I could be leading honor council. And at Vanderbilt Honor Council and student government, president had special houses they lived in right by the campus leadership. And so I ran for honor council president. I prayed, and in my speech that I gave for honor council president, I talked about I wanted to be a servant leader like Jesus. And I used illustrations how Jesus was a servant leader. So I ran and I prayed, and guess what? I lost. And I was like, God, what is going on? And what I didn't know that day, but now I can look back on and say is, you know what? God had something better for me. And what it turned out is that I had become a young believer there, and God said, no, you know what? I don't want you to live alone with these leadership people. I want you to live with 5 solid Christian guys who are going to teach you, Todd, how to walk with God. And so I spent the next year living with 5 wonderful, godly Christian men who really modeled for me what a young Christian life should look like. And those 5 guys are some of my dearest friends to this day. Had God answered my prayer, I would have not had that. But God saw that there was a bigger heart issue that Todd needed as opposed to what Todd thought he needed, right? And so I don't know what you're dealing with today. You know, some of you may be sick. Some of you may be facing financial hardship. Some of you may be struggling with your kids or your grandkids or whatever it is that you are praying to God. I want you just to take comfort in the fact that God may not answer your prayer exactly like what you think, but God is working for you and for your good. You know, Romans 8, for God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to your purpose. Okay. So as you're praying, just remember, we take our request to God, but walking in faith means God may not answer the way I think he should, but he's going to answer in a way that he knows is best for me. Okay. So then let's look at, Jesus is going to then come alongside him and tell a parable. And he says this parable. Let's read the parable in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 16. Jesus told them this parable, saying, the land of a certain rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now, who will own what you have prepared? So Jesus goes on with this parable, and the word parable just means to come alongside. So whenever you see Jesus tell a parable, it's a story with a point. And in this case, he actually tells us what the point is right before it is, be aware of your greed or your covetousness. And he's going to tell them a story to illustrate of why you need to be aware of that and covetousness. So he explains the story, and it starts out with a rich man. And Jesus doesn't condemn rich men. There is nothing wrong with being wealthy in this world. Think of some of the great Bible heroes. Abraham, wealthy beyond all belief. King David, Solomon. These were wealthy, wealthy men that God had blessed. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy, nor does Jesus condemn it. But Jesus does give us many warnings about being rich is dangerous. there are a lot of temptations of being wealthy. And he's going to give us an illustration here of how wealth led one man to his demise. Now, we don't know all the details of the story, right? Jesus just gives us this parable, but what might have been going through the mind of someone hearing this story? So let me just paint a little picture for you. So there was a man, he was a certain rich man, so he was obviously very successful. And let me tell you, you don't get to be wealthy farming land unless you are a hard worker, right? Farming and tilling the land and the ground, you've got to be a hard worker, you've got to be smart, you've got to plant your crops. He was industrious, he was successful. Many values that we would applaud. And so this man, he realizing, oh my goodness, my crops are booming, I'm not going to have anywhere to put them. And so he looks at his situation and says, wow, my barns aren't big enough. I should build bigger barns so that I can store all this stuff, so I can lay up for myself all this riches so that I can rest and be merry and be happy. And so this man starts thinking, and he's going to lay out this idea of building these bigger barns. And so he gets the town architect to come in, and he gets the builder to come in, and he starts meeting with the architect and the builder of laying out how he's going to do this and building these bigger barns. And so one night, he's sitting there with his architect and his builder, and they're going through the plans and laying out the details. And it starts getting later, and his wife comes up to him and says, honey, it's getting late. I'm going to bed. Don't stay up too late. She kisses him on the forehead, and she goes up to bed. And he's like, yeah, we'll be up in a little bit. So he keeps meeting with the architect and the builder. And finally, the architect says, listen, I need to go. I'll take these plans home. I'll work on them. We'll meet again tomorrow. I'll finish them up. And so the architect and the builder head out, and this guy's thinking to himself, man, I'm going to just go over these plans one more time. I'm going to check the numbers. And so he's sitting at the table by himself, and he hears at the door. And he's like, who's that? And as he goes to the door, he feels the aroma in the room. And he opens the door up and says, who are you? He says, I am death, and I have come for your soul. Guy's like, no. You're not in my appointment book. I'm not expecting you. Why didn't you give me any warning? And Death said, what? I've given you so many warnings. Your parents died. Remember your good friend down the road? He died. Remember the young lady at the synagogue? She died. You've had plenty of warning. And now I've come to count you out. 10, 9, 8. Whoa. No, it's not my time. It's not my time. I've got all these plans. 7, 6, 5. No. I'll give half of what I own to the poor. Half of what I own. 4, 3. No, I'll give it all. I'll give it all. 2, 1. The next morning, his wife comes downstairs, see the rich man hunched over his table, thinking he fell asleep on his plans. She goes over to try to wake him, discovers he's dead. Sadness spreads from the house to the neighbors to the village as they understand this rich, industrious, successful, progressive, visionary man has passed away. They have a funeral. The mayor of the funeral comes and speaks at this funeral. The whole town comes together. This is the kind of guy that we should all be like. He worked hard. He was successful. He had it all. And then they take him and they put his body in the ground and they put a tombstone over his name with his name on the tombstone and his birth year and his date of death. and everyone goes back to your house. That night, God comes down, and on that tombstone, he writes F-O-O-L. Fool. What that city and village thought of this great man, this man that we should all be like, God labels with one word: fool. Psalm 14:1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And it's not just you say it, but you live your life as if there's no God. And this man lived his life as if there was no God. Listen to the way he talks about himself in the parable. And I'm going to read it with a little bit more emphasis this side. So the land of a certain rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store up all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for you. Take ease, drink, and be merry. See, he was living a life as if there was no God. And God has one word for that: fool. Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure. Hedonism is this searching after drugs, alcohol, sex, money, whatever it is, of living a life of pleasure. And God says that is fool. And, someday, I'm 55, someday I hope to retire. But see, I don't plan on retiring to a life of hedonism. I plan on retiring to a life of, hey, I don't have to go to work anymore to make money, so now I have much more time to serve God. I can do this, I can do that. And trying to live my life in a manner that's pleasing God, as opposed to living a life of, well, I want to play golf 5 days a week, and I really like the Virgin Islands. We're going to go cruising through the Virgin Islands, or whatever it is, whatever it is. That's not what God's intent is for retirement. God's intent is if you ever get to the point where you have enough financial means to retire, you do it in such a manner that then you can serve God more fully, and you're not constrained by some of the financial constraints of this world. So Jesus says, the heart of the matter is guard your heart. Be on guard against all forms of greed or covetousness, right? So how do we do that? How do we guard our hearts? So I have a few things that are useful to me and will probably be useful to some of you. The first thing is you need to make sure that you are diligently spending time in God's Word and in prayer. You need to be looking up for your guidance, not this way. Because what I found is if I look horizontally, one of two things is going to happen to me. One is I'm going to look at someone wealthier than me and say, wow, that person has this type of house, or that person has this or that, and then I'm going to feel covetousness towards that person because they've got this and I don't. Or I look at someone and say, I got something that this person doesn't have. I must be smarter or better or whatever, right? It's either covetousness or pride when you're looking and comparing yourself to other people. So we've got to make sure that we're staying in that vertical relationship with God and reading His Word and being reminded of the truth. And one of the reasons why I picked this passage is because this is something I struggle with. I want more and more and more of what I already have enough of. And one of my earliest memories as a child, I was about 3, and I had a big wheel, and my neighbor had a big green machine. And it was the same concept as a big wheel, but instead of a steering wheel, it had levers that you used to turn it. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. And here I am, 52 years later, and I still remember how bad I wanted that big green machine that I didn't have. Right? Yeah, I mean, all of us can remember. And then another story that has struck me is my parents had a 18-foot ski boat, and when they got done with that, they passed it down to me. And I would take my kids, and we would go out on Lake Austin, and we would have a great time. And I had 13 people on this little ski boat, and one of my friends said he saw us out there, and he said, you look like you were one of those Vietnam boat people. Like, people were hanging off the side. You're wondering, how are they going to fall off? But we had 13 people on this little boat. We had a great time, and it was so sweet until what? Until that 23-foot wake surfing boat went by my boat. And all of a sudden, I went from, because all of a sudden, my covetous heart, man, I'd be happy if I had the 23-foot wake surfing boat. Right? And that's just the way it is. Our sin nature will work to develop and draw these needs in. And so, I just had to keep reminding myself on that boat, it's just like, Todd, a thankful heart is a happy heart. And I've got to be thankful for the things that I have and not be focused on the things I don't have. Listen to what Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge a man into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. Right? That's Paul's antidote for struggling with covetousness. Pursue righteousness, pursue godliness, pursue faith, pursue love, pursue perseverance. One of the Proverbs chapter 30, which has always been very meaningful to me. 2 things I ask of you, Lord, before I die. Do not refuse me. Keep falsehood and lies far from me, and give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise I have met too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal, so that I dishonor the name. I will tell you, it is extremely, extremely hard for me to pray, God, don't give me riches. It's hard. I want it. I want it. It's my flesh wants it. And again, I think that I'm not the only one here who probably struggles with this. So let me wrap up with a couple stories here. A couple years ago, a friend of mine called and said, hey, his mom has Alzheimer's. They need to get her into a memory care unit, and my dad's going to go move into my sister. Can you come help me clean out their home? Can you bring your trailer? So I went, drove my trailer. We got there, my friend and I. We loaded all their possessions onto the back of my trailer, and I took my trailer to Goodwill. That man's entire life's possessions in one day went from his home to my trailer to Goodwill. That's where we're all headed, folks. Don't spend your life accumulating all this stuff. Jesus says, seek first his kingdom, and all these things will be added unto you. And then in verse 34 of chapter 12, he says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. There's an artist, Kristen Bush, who had a famous song a few years ago. It's called Trailer Hitch. And there are very few songs I think really strike it a chord that's correct. And here's what he says. I don't know why everyone wants to die rich. You can't take it with you when you go. I've never seen a hearse with a trailer hitch. What a truth of that. Don't live your life foolishly by chasing after things you can't take with you. Live your life pursuing God and pursuing righteousness. Because as best as I can tell, the death rate is 100%. Live your life like that. Worship team, you can come on up. I want to end with an Italian fable. Okay? The Italian fable goes like this. There was a master who had a servant. And the master was frustrated because his servant was so stupid. And he said, I have never seen someone as stupid as you. And he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you my staff, and I want you to carry my staff. And if you ever meet someone more stupid than you, I want you to give that staff to him. So the servant takes it, and so the servant goes around, and he never finds anybody to give the staff to. And then finally the master comes back to him and says, hey, I'm going to be going on a journey here soon. And the servant says, oh, well, are you prepared? And the master said, no, actually I'm not. And then the servant says, oh, well, did you not know that you were going to be going on this journey? He's like, yeah, I knew, but I just didn't prepare. And then the servant comes and hands him the staff and says, I have finally met a man more stupid than myself. Amen.